Why is this small southwestern Indian state so fundamental to the Gulf and to its culture and history?
My larger inquiry has been about how the oil economy of the what I call the GCC enabled flows of people, materials, media technology, infrastructure, lifestyles, and cultural forms.
It actually was the first place in Qatar and probably most of the Gulf that you had access to films that weren't major theatrical releases of the moment.
Dubai, for example, has emerged as one of the major post-production centers for different kinds of film industries around the world.
The Kerala factor in it. They were the shipbuilders. It just seems like so much more in looking at the cross-media, cross-cultural exchange between Kerala and the Gulf.
The desert is something which is a larger character. I would say that it's as important as all other characters in the film.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alia Yunis, and I'm really happy to be hosting this episode of Kawalis. And today with me is Bindu Menon. Bindu is an associate professor at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. But she is from Kerala, and Kerala is going to be the focus of our discussion today. Bindu and I met in 2018 while we were working. She came to a conference that we hosted at NYU around film and digital media in the Gulf. And it was the first such gathering that we had done, and we had no idea that it was going to be so popular in terms of how much interest there was coming, looking at the connections between the Gulf and a greater space. So we looked at the Gulf as a fluid space. And the results of the conference itself was a double issue from Middle East Journal of Culture and Communications, focusing on the Gulf and media. And Bindu had a chapter in that. And then there was also a book that has just come out from Indiana University Press called Reorienting the Middle East. And Bindu also has a chapter in that. And that'll be a bit of a focus of today's discussion. But I think for a lot of people, there's this whole question of Kerala itself. Why is this small southwestern Indian state so fundamental to the Gulf and to its culture and history? And why have so many people in Kerala migrated at all different levels of society and careers and professions to the Gulf? So I think, Bindu, first of all, welcome. And maybe you could frame Kerala as a place in relationship to the Gulf before we get into the more specifics of film and media.
Thanks, Alia, and also the Afikra podcast. This is really a important moment in history that we are talking about these particular connections between Kerala and the Gulf Coast. To begin with, I want to foreground that as someone who's been working on migration in the context of media in the past more than a decade, is that movement and migration are at the heart of modern Gulf Council countries and South Asian societies. So the connection between Kerala in particular and largely the Malabar coast with the Peninsular Gulf has been historically enabled by two distinct aspects. One, as the major ports in the Indian Ocean trade routes, and second, as a major source of spice trade. And it has been traced back by recent archaeological excavations to connections that go back to the 1st century AD, and other historical evidence kind of point towards the presence of Arab trade communities in different parts of what is contemporary Kerala, and particularly the Malabar coast towards the northern part of Kerala. However, the current migrant population of the Malayalis in the Gulf, Malayalam is the language spoken in Kerala, and the people of Kerala are either known as Keralites in its Anglified version or Malayalis in more local language. So the Kerala immigrants in the Gulf primarily emerged from the post-oil labor migration since the 1960s to various locations of the contemporary Gulf Council Cooperation countries, to the major cities of this particular region. If you look at numbers, in the decades between 1970s and 2000s, the GCC destinations almost dominates the Kerala immigrant landscape. And currently, according to a migration report, Malayalis form the largest immigrant group in the GCC, with the most recent estimate caps it around something like 3.5 million. The post-oil migration has also been very central in enabling a remittance-based economy in Kerala. What I'm trying to say is that there is much work that helps us understand this remittance-based economy in Kerala and its foundation to what is described as a very strong social welfare system in Kerala. And there is very rich scholarship on the political economy and the sociology of migration, etc. What is yet to emerge is the other materialities and affective aspects that will help us understand migration as a very complex material and affective phenomenon, which I believe can only be captured by being able to look at what lies in the texture of everyday life, objects, memories, and other texts. So my larger inquiry has been about how the oil economy of what is called the GCC enabled flows of people, materials, media technology, infrastructure, lifestyles, and cultural forms.
So your look at the media that flows between Kerala and the Gulf actually starts with the oil as well. But also you mirror two things. It's the oil brings all these people to the Gulf, but at the same time, it's a huge media revolution happening that affects the people of Kerala, affects all of us, but specifically in the context of your research. What is it about the 70s to the 90s that really changed how we look at media, especially how it was consumed and produced, that affects us still today?
So, as I mentioned, this post-oil economy and what kind of flows, movements happened both materially, textually, and affectively is something which I look at. And what I query really is media, by which I mean cinema, television, photography, videography, music, as you're aware, Alia. The second essay I wrote for your volume from Indiana University Press particularly looked at the different kinds of audio cassette practices that happened between the migrant lives in the Gulf and the Kerala coast, the homeland. So I've looked at even speech as a particular media form across both of these spaces. And what it allowed me to understand is to access rich and diverse history of communities, very vibrant networks of people, intricate webs of connections, very circuitry, migratory paths of media objects, and trajectories that allows us to emancipate histories that both challenge and undermine and complement reigning narratives, as well as shedding very unfamiliar light on aspects of this migration. What I mean is, and through the examples that I want to give, it's fairly now evident that the Gulf Council countries, the remittance economy, has been very central in creating a certain set of consumer practices, access to media goods. But what is not really so visible is how the Gulf Council sites have been particularly enabled by migration. If you allow me, Alia, I would like to first go into few stories of people who have worked within a very limited media infrastructure of the host countries in Gulf Council states and created actually a media culture in these spaces. What I really am interested, not only that South Asia has benefited, it's also the certain kind of creative transgression from the migrant communities that enabled a certain media culture in the Gulf Council countries as well.
Yeah, we'd like to get into the specifics of them because you have some really interesting clips to show us. I know a lot of your focus is what happens in the 70s and to the 90s is before the digital revolution kicks in, revolution of the video cassette and the revolution of the audio cassette, and that frames a lot of your work on both, like you said, the actual equipment that was being traded, but also what was being put onto those systems. The audio cassette, let's start with that because I know that there's a very specific genre that develops. I'm not going to pronounce it. You'll pronounce it. The very specific type of musical love letters that go between the Gulf and Kerala, from the migrant workers to the people back home and vice versa. If you could tell us a little bit why that specific genre developed and what it is.
Okay, so there are two aspects to this media modernity that I talk about that emerges in the southwestern coast of India in relation to Gulf. One of which is this, that in the 1970s, that is also a broader history of the audio cassette itself. It's in a different sense that I'm saying that the Gulf Council locations become significant in modern media history. So I'd like to sidetrack a little bit and talk about this really important work by Kyle Devine, who has showed that moving from shellac to plastics, roughly around 1950s, prompted a very complete reorganization of the music industry. By which what he means is that it's largely accepted in music technology history as well, that the emergence of plastic, which is primarily a petrochemical derivative, makes the Gulf a very important site for the production of audio cassette and video cassettes later. The cultural history of audio cassettes have been very well traced by historians in the context of India and in Kerala. And I've also explored this to show the movement of sound and reproduction media like tape recorders, cassettes, and stereos, etc., which was enabled through the migrants moving between these spaces. You come back home, you're visiting home, you come back with the tape recorder, you come back with the stereo, you introduce new musical listening practices. That's one. The other is the illicit trade routes of smuggling between the lesser class-aspired economy, particularly in Dubai and other peninsular Gulf cities and the port cities of the Western Indian Ocean. Smuggling was a really important part of it. Some of the specific economic aspects of the Indian economy where these consumer goods had a high tariff to pay also made smuggling somewhat an accepted practice for this kind of movement of the goods. But the specific audio cassette practice that emerged, I wrote about it in two senses. One is, of course, new genres were explored in the context of audio cassettes. The particular audio cassettes that I worked on, following some other cultural history tracing of that particular format and genre, is something called the Dubai Qatar, which means a Dubai letter, right? And letter songs is an older traditional genre of expressions of love and different kinds of love, familial, also love between couples, tinged with certain kind of loneliness, yearning for the absent beloved. It's across Indo-Persian, different kinds of writing practices. But this is a very particular moment in the 1970s when there is large number of working class and labor moving towards the Gulf, abandoning a large number of women back home in Kerala. And here I'm particularly talking about the Muslim households in Malabar, which initiates large changes within the society. Suddenly, women are made to head the household. There is also immense different kinds of pressures on them on account of the absent husband and father figures in the family. So they go through serious emotional challenges. And there are different kinds of ways in which this is processed within the society. A self-trained counselor, Mr. S.A. Jamil, who has listened to these narratives of women in this period of time, writes a song and sings the song in context of performance, assuming the voice of a woman who's yearning for her husband, narrating to him the difficulties of her life, and also somewhat lovingly he said, blame him for his absence. So after his first set of performances, which was also performed in the Gulf, it was massively accepted, received among the residents of the Gulf Council cities. He traveled to the Gulf and performed it in various places. It's also narrated that the first time he performed, this I cite in my essay as well, there were important accounts of how people were moved to tears and sometimes went to kind of frenzy and so on. What happens from there is that it becomes a major genre within the audio cassette industry, and the music starts traveling quite widely between the Gulf, and there were several versions, and it starts circulating between the Gulf Council countries. There's also a response song to it, but there are other kinds of practices related to the audio cassettes as well, which I actually consider really important. The audio cassette comes in at a time which is an interlude between more paper-based communication systems to the digitally enabled media in the late 1990s. So it's an important period where a particular different forms of auditory practices emerge. And one of it is that the immigrants in the Gulf often taped their letters to their family members back home, and their friends would carry it back home, the audio cassette letters. And on the return, when they're coming back, they would collect the audio cassettes where the family members, including the father, the mother, siblings, and wife, etc., would have recorded something for them. So what I explore in the essay is also to not just think about only the genre, this particular music genre, but of course I think about questions of voice. What does it mean to assume the voice of a woman and sing? What kind of traditions is it appealing to? How does it work? But also I think about questions of the machine sensory, the very act of listening, and what this kind of a sonic reproduction of voice does to the experience of migration. So I look into questions of sensory nature, questions of voice, and also questions of thinking about the audio cassette itself as a kind of important presence, as a sensing body that transmits the flows of the sound of distant homes, or the speech that so many would describe as a friend across the ocean in their accounts. So there is rich ways in which sound occupies a certain, sensory realm within this whole set of media objects that are moving between the Gulf and other places. These are not practices unknown. There are ways in which Italian immigrants have used this. Pakistani immigrants between UK and Pakistan has used this kind of audio cassette letters. The tape letters acquires a very particular place and translates the experience of migration into more intimate registers of recognition through these practices.
Even within the Arab world, too, I remember
Yes,
that as a child in the States, that we would get audio cassettes from relatives in Lebanon and in Palestine and Jordan, and we would send them back. I don't know if they ever, but in the Gulf, you saw it last a much longer time. Before we move on to the visual and we stick with the audio a little bit, I wanted us maybe to listen, because there's a huge Sufi influence in these love letters. And I guess that reflects that there's a Sufi influence in Kerala as well. But in this imitation of women writing these quite sexual letters, but they're being sung by men and written by men on behalf of women is actually really interesting. And I don't know if maybe we could listen to one, and then the responses would also be coming from the Gulf, right back to the wives. And it is one of those stories that's often long in the absence of the husband for so long. And I know there's been a lot of work in Egypt as well around the migration and how it created these art forms around the absence of the father and the absence of the husband. I think maybe it'll be interesting for us to listen to them.
Yeah, I think it would be lovely to listen to the Dubai Qatar and its repartee, which is a response from the husband owning up to his mistakes, owning up to this abandonment.
മധുരാനുഭൂതികളയവിറക്കി മനസ്സിൽ വീണടിയും പൂപേറുക്കി കരളിൻ ചുടുരക്ത മഷിയിൽ മുക്കി.
We should also focus on the visual and the video cassette before we move into contemporary times. I know, for example, you recently wrote about a video store in Doha that I actually remember also, and it still exists, I think. It actually was the first place in Qatar and probably most of the Gulf that you had access to films that weren't major theatrical releases of the moment. Even if there were no theaters in the Gulf at that time, a consumption of film was these video cassettes, and they were from Hollywood and Bollywood. But this opened up a whole way of looking at film. If you could tell us a little bit about that store that still exists and for me was so valuable.
There's some things which I tracked about the music technology history, relevant to understand the video cassettes as well, which is the Gulf's prominence of petrochemical derived industries made it a very ideal site for video cassettes. So before I move into the question of the video stores, so this particular video store that you're talking about, Alia, the International Video Center, is one of my favorite stories of what the immigrants does to the Gulf media landscape. We always think about the Gulf as providing something, providing this kind of industries, allows consumption, lifestyle choices, etc. But we don't really think in terms of what the immigrant does to. And one of my arguments is that there is immense creative migration into these spaces over the last 50 years of migration. The International Video Center, which was started by who came to be known as IVC Abdullah or International Video Center Abdullah, who's a Malayali migrant, and I would like to call him a connector in the Waterbenaminian sense of the word. He's an archivist, he was a cinephile, and he was also a musician, someone who was interested in plays, and he was even sometimes called Shakespeare, and sometimes he was called IVC Peninsula, etc. So he established this in the 1981, and the store, as you remember, Alia, worked as the site of a range of intersecting issues. He was credited as an essential node for cultivating knowledge on cinema and media, and introducing new genres to both Qatari elites and Indian immigrants, as well as the European expats. So as you are very well aware, what was available in Qatar in the 1980s was primarily Egyptian and Lebanese films, with some smattering of Bollywood films, etc. Abdullah was a cinephile, right? So the other thing which I want to mention is that most of the Indian immigrants leave Kerala, which I'm particularly aware of, had an opening up to both literary, media, and cinema cultures. Particularly in the 1980s, they went to a place where such infrastructures were either limited or were under different regimes and so on, and they built their own. This is what I call a certain kind of creative transgression, which each of them did. To get back to the IVC story, Abdullah traveled a lot, and as a cinephile, who's, in his life in Kerala as a young man, in different canons of art house cinema, constantly traveled searching for original prints of classical films. And at one time, it is reported that he had a collection of nearly 25,000 films, making it one of the biggest libraries of the whole of Gulf region. So it became an urban landmark for films, meeting place, and opened access to broad aesthetic choices and engaged in a very heterogeneous audience and opened Doha towards multiple routes of video circulation and exchange.
And he still has the shop? It's still open?
No, he passed away just before the COVID in 2017 or 18 period. So the store doesn't exist anymore. But I know that for many Doha residents, this was a very fond and important cultural memory of the city. What is interesting is that, also because I'm aware of stories in Qatar from Qatari elites and stories in the Malayalam film industry about how it became a provider of very broad aesthetic choices to both these places, right? So it became a node of cultural exchange between very divergent groups who are not otherwise directly connected. That's another favorite story of mine, how immigrants kind of shaped, the Gulf. But the other thing about video cassettes in particular is also the history of how it became very particularly relevant for the South Asian context. In the initial years of video cassette industry, where South Asia and in the Indian coast largely lacked video production facilities. One of the ways in which particularly Malayalam film industry worked was where the analog cassettes will move from the Kerala coast to the Gulf Council cities. And there were many video cassette production companies like Thomson, which is based in UAE, and others who are, if I remember correctly, and others who worked from Qatar, like Superstar, Bindu Menon, Ijaz, Nas, etc. from Doha, who would convert them into video cassettes, and it would be distributed across the region, but it would also travel back to India. So it was a very interesting kind of movement of different kinds of film tech and an industry emerging there, operating within strict regimes of copyright in Qatar and not so strict regimes in the initial days of those days in Malayalam film industry. They turned the analog print to the mutable format of video in the Gulf Council sites. So this, I think, is also a very material aspect to remember about. So there are interesting texts and formations like video stores, but also the very political economy and ecology of a petrochemical derived industry that binds both South Asia and the Gulf. This is how I think of it, not just as isolated text or isolated political economy, but as something which is binding itself in multiple ways.
So would you say then that because this cinema was produced in Kerala, but reproduced and for mass consumption through video cassettes in the Gulf, that the industry actually grew because of the opportunity to mass produce? Because now we think of Malayalam cinema as a thing. Yeah. Fair to say that the Gulf gave it a chance by allowing it to reproduce for mass consumption?
Yes, I would say that. Yeah, that's actually a very excellent question. Of course, on its own, it was a very recognizable industry within India with very diverged. There's mainstream popular cinema, but Kerala also has a history of a certain kind of art house cinema from the very early days. But that was limited to the space, to the terracentric limitations of the land-sealed methods. But this allowed many things. The video cassette, its portability, audio and video are more portable kind of mediums than what preceded, like the analog film rolls. So this is why I think that we need to simultaneously think about the political ecology of petrochemical derived industries in the Gulf, the political economy of being able to reproduce it, the migrant figures present there, and the text circulating between this gives us a much more complex picture of this relation.
It is really interesting. And also because so far we haven't talked about the presence of the Gulf in Kerala or Malayalam cinema. And I know that you know a fair amount, and there's a chapter in the book actually specifically about the first Kerala or Malayalam film to have been made with the Gulf as the main space. And I think that there's themes in there that you carry on talking about in your research, especially about the idea of the dhow, which, just to clarify for everyone, is the main vessel that came and traded across the Indian Ocean. And so if you could talk about like how they saw themselves within a Gulf context in that first film and how that sort of progressed.
We Can't Disappointment, which is Dreams for Sale, is the first film that Sebastian's work in the book, which reflects on Dubai as a shooting location where the film was shot, the production of it, the challenges of producing it, but also recording the Gulf for the first time on camera, right? The space of the Gulf, especially Dubai, which is both utopian and dystopian. So there is literature which precedes it. There has been a number of writings in Malayalam, and they are popular by the 1980s. There is the Gulf returning, the Gulf objects which travel. There's much research on this and recording of this, both in popular cultural texts as well as scholarly literature. There is this record of different kinds of things that are circulating between the Gulf and Kerala. So the Gulf becomes actually a presence in everyday life in Kerala by the late 1970s. But it's Vilkaninde Swapnangal, the film that we mentioned, which actually first visibilizes that space. It's a dreamscape in many ways, but also there's this subterranean sense, the space of extraction of labor, other extractive practices of oil, etc. And the film actually shot in late 1970s. In fact, visualizes it for the Malayali audience for the first time by location shoot in that space. The story has changed now in the sense that there has been a good investment from the Gulf Council countries, from Malayali immigrants in Malayalam film history, production houses, video cassette companies, audio cassette companies. So the Malayalam film and media industry then gets connected to the Gulf in multiple ways. The imaginary of the Gulf is one aspect of it. Also, there are many, many films which are set in the Gulf Council countries now in the last 30 years. But there's also immense presence of the Gulf migration in the political economy of the film and media industry. And you are aware of some of the research which has looked into television, for example, how satellite television moved into the Gulf space and how the most television channels have a bureau in the Gulf Council countries. There are also FM radio stations in major cities of Doha, Dubai, and so on in the Malayalam language transmission. So there is a much more complex picture now from that early days of very few media techs and so on to a very big industrial networks. But also I want to add creative labor migration. I don't have the numbers in my hand. Dubai, for example, has emerged as one of the major post-production centers for different kinds of film industries around the world. And in many of the special economic zones where production has taken place, or there is an intensity of media production, there is a large number of creative labor migration into these spaces. So the creative labor migration, I would add, apart from the industrial networks, textual representation, etc., it needs to be thought as part of this process of migration and media.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I did post production on my last film, I did it in Dubai. It was a company that's owned and operated and employs a great deal of people from Kerala. It's become a really good space for employment and for an industry that needs it. They're in the industry early on. I'm curious to see how that'll go with time because it's both a competitive space for film and a not competitive space for film. It's a bit challenging to operate there and sustain it. So we'll see as we come closer to coming to an end. You have this idea, and this goes back to the Dreams for Sale film and the films that would follow. This idea of creative migration, which we've talked about now in all these different ways. But there's that physical piece of migration that you also address, which is the dhow itself and its place in cinema and in the creative industries. Because the dhow is also a shared heritage, let's say, with the Gulf and Southwest India. I know, for example, in Abu Dhabi, they just built a huge replica of a dhow that would have sailed during the Bronze Age, but the only people that could build it were people from Kerala. So there was actually people from Kerala that were brought to the UAE to build this boat that will now be the centerpiece of the new Zayed National Museum. So the dhow figures largely in this shared heritage and who can claim it. And I thought you would maybe address, because you've written about it, how that plays into film and media production.
This was a very difficult question to track, also because of the archives that I started searching for was very opaque, because there is very little accounts of illicit trade per se. You have very few records. You have accounts, but you don't have records. So it was not readily available to conventional history writing. But at the same time, what I did was a kind of field research in the coastal towns of Kerala, where this is also aware to every Malayali, but also to many other parts of the world. The coastal towns were the first ones to actually accept different kinds of consumption practices, which is where the first set of goods actually come. All kinds of goods, clothes to perfumes to electronic goods to watches. So that there are small places everywhere across the Malabar coast where there would be a small town, a small market in towns which is named after that port city as a kind of adjective to the market. So it would be called the Dubai market or Gulf market. So the coastal town of Tirur, for example, It is called the Tirur Gulf Market, and it's a huge market for electronic goods. People come from neighboring states to buy this. Now, the roots of this kind of goods movement has changed tremendously. There is also a major route of smuggled goods through the mountains, through Nepal and the Himalayan border entering the country. That's a different topic. But what I started looking for is, in the absence of official archives of what kind of media goods moved, especially in the 1970s, how did it move? How did it come to these coastal towns? Was to kind of access some of the early stores which would sell audio cassettes and eventually video cassettes in the 1980s, but mostly in the 1970s. So this is what actually made me see that the smaller port towns connected to the larger towns, there's also an Indian Ocean history of changes that has happened to different port cities. By the end of the British rule, the Kerala coast major port towns had shifted to or centralized to Bombay. All of these movement was happening sometimes directly, sometimes via Bombay. But it is evident by talking to these people that a large number of goods, particularly in the 1970s, arrived through the conduit of dhow. And this is really important for me to understand that media cultures and media modernity does not emerge in every part of the same nation state the same way. So if this kind of oceanic connections were very central to the formation of a media modernity in the Kerala coast, the history of that is very different, let's say, in Bombay, or let's say in a city like Delhi. This was something which I was trying to map by looking at the dhow itself. But in looking at that, I also looked at how was the dhow present in film and media texts. And I looked at photography. There are interesting photography projects done by the artist K.R. Sunil, who was actually looking at people who were dhow workers. I also looked at different Malayalam films, for example, who have very iconic scenes of the first kind of illicit migration, which is via the dhow, which is not basically a cargo ship, where people would be transported across the ocean from smaller ports and small cove in the coast. That becomes actually a very important part of the migration narrative. So many films and amateur films, like the home films of Malabar, which I researched on, and the mainstream Malayalam films. So for example, Vilkananda Sopnangal has a very classic opening sequence which begins with the ocean and the cargo ship against the sun setting and so on, and then people migrating and losing their life to the sea and arriving in the port almost without any means. So this kind of a hardship of migration is visualized and epitomized in this dhow movement. So I looked at the dhow as both narrative devices around the dhow, other kinds of imagination around the dhow, like in some of the documentaries that look into the traditional dhow, and mainstream cinema, photography, etc. I looked at the dhow as both cultural heritage, as a conduit, as a infrastructure of a media modernity, and also as a kind of major part of the migration in the migration narrative.
Let's end today with the new phenomenon film, which, because I think you have a lot of thoughts on it. I still haven't seen it. I'm really curious to see it. But I think it's broken all kinds of box office records. And it's called The Goat Life, and it's based on a novel, and it's Malayalam cinema. It's a box office hit, and it's very focused on the Gulf. And I don't know if maybe you could talk about how you position that film as a way of wrapping up our discussion in terms of creative migration, and if we should all go see it.
The film is an adaptation of a very well-known novel, which is loosely based on an actual story of immigration under very abject conditions. It has struck a chord with large number of Malayalam migrants, and it is actually something which corresponds very well with the earlier phase of migration. And in this case, it's particularly the migration to the Saudi Arabian desert in the narrative, which at that point of time was also largely happening not under the strict humanitarian watch over these matters. The scenario has changed quite a bit now. with more humanitarian agencies and human rights agencies that work in the context of Gulf migration. It's a story that is about the abject conditions of migration. It's the most objective Gulf migration that you can imagine, which is set not in a city, but in a desert, not even in a village. And it's captivity. It's not imagined as something which is happening under the regime of law. There is trickery, there is cheating, and it's set in the desert. Right? So the desert actually emerges as a really important character in the film. There are significant changes from the focus of the novel and the film are very different. But also it's interesting because it is something which actually alerts us to the experience of migration and its most abject possibilities and the precarity, the temporariness, the captivity of migrant life. It teases out that, I think, particularly through the visuals. I watched the film once through the visualization of the desert itself. This is my reading of it, right? The desert means many things in many narratives, right? In this particular film, I think the desert is a larger character. I would say that it's as important as all other characters in the film. And it's visualized through multiple registers of solitude, abjectness, captivity, of everything which is a lack. So I guess that is something which is really important and very relevant narrative of migration for larger Malayali migration to the Gulf. And yes, particularly to an older generation of migrants. Things have changed a lot on many fronts and in different ways. You have second generation of immigrants who have a very different experience of the life in the Gulf societies. You have more privileged migration to many destinations. But this remains what you call the oral text of the Malayalam migration. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which the film actually makes itself relevant to this larger narrative of migration. This is how I read it.
And obviously, there was an audience craving to see this.
When I was in Doha, I was checking at what are the films that are just out of curiosity. And the first in the list was Goat Life. This was the month of May, early May. And in the rankings, it was Goat Life, which was first in the list of films.
Interesting. Because it would not only speak to the Malayalam story, it would also speak to any other countries. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about also, but I know it's getting late where you are. Thank you for this conversation and thank you for being part of the book.
Thanks so much for this opportunity, for this conversation. It was lovely to visit some of the moments in this journey of researching on the Gulf and media and so on. Useful to, in some ways, summarize key aspects of my own work. Thank you so much, Alia and Fikra, for this opportunity. Thanks.